The stew still steamed when it hit the floor. Thick gravy splashed across the tiles, bits of carrot and beef sliding under the table legs. For a second I couldn't move. My hands trembled around the wooden spoon, still warm from stirring. Then Vanessa's voice cut through the silence like glass. "Next time, don't bother cooking this garbage again," she said, her lipstick perfect, her tone sharper than the knife I'd used to cut the onions. "You're nothing but trash in this house." Michael looked down at his plate, pretending to study the mashed potatoes. My granddaughter Lena froze mid-scroll on her phone, her eyes wide. I just stood there, heart thudding like a slow drum. I'd taught first grade for 40 years and learned how to stay calm when a child threw a tantrum. But this wasn't a child. This was my daughter-in-law, the woman who'd just thrown my dinner on the floor. Vanessa turned and walked away, her heels clicking across the hardwood. I could still smell the rosemary, the meat I'd browned so carefully, the effort wasted. Slowly, I knelt, picked up the broken plate, and whispered to myself, I used to clean up for everyone else. Tonight, I'm cleaning up for me. I smiled, small, tight, deliberate, because tomorrow morning things would not be the same. I've always believed that a home reflects its owner's heart. Mine sits at the edge of Asheville, North Carolina, a one-story house Henry and I built together in 1983. He's been gone 6 years now, and the place still smells faintly of cedar and coffee, the scent of our mornings. Every spring I repaint the porch railing, plant marigolds in the boxes, and tell myself I'm keeping the memories alive. When Henry died, I promised I'd never let this house go. It was more than wood and bricks. It was 40 years of sacrifice, early mornings teaching, spelling to restless kids, saving every dollar instead of taking vacations, watching Henry come home from the auto shop with grease on his hands and pride in his eyes. We built our peace here. I thought it would protect me. Then Michael lost his job. He called one Sunday, voice thin and tired. "Mom, things are rough. We might need to stay with you for a while." I didn't hesitate. "Of course, honey, this house is yours too." I baked bread that night, aired out the guest rooms, bought fresh flowers. I imagined laughter again echoing down these halls. I even washed the curtains twice. But when the door opened and Vanessa walked in, first sunglasses, designer bag, perfume that smelled expensive and cold, I felt a chill. She smiled, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Thanks for having us, Mrs. Monroe." "Just temporary, right, until Michael gets back on his feet." "Call me Clara," I said. She glanced around. "It's cozy, maybe a little old-fashioned." That night I heard her whisper to someone on the phone from the guest room, "This place smells like old people." I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles, the air thick with something unspoken. The first few days passed in uneasy politeness. I cooked breakfast. She complained the coffee was too strong. I folded laundry. She refolded it properly. Michael tried to keep peace, sitting between us like a man trapped between two storms. Only Lena, my sweet 15-year-old granddaughter, softened the air. She helped me bake cookies and asked about her grandpa. But even she had learned silence from her mother, how to disappear when tension filled a room. That night, the night of the stew, I had wanted to make peace. I'd used Henry's old recipe, the one Michael loved when he was a boy. I set the table with my fine china lit candles and told myself that warmth could change anything. At first, dinner was quiet. Michael murmured thanks. Lena smiled shyly. I ladled stew into bowls, the smell of thyme and red wine filling the kitchen. Then Vanessa lifted her spoon, frowned, and slammed it down. "Seriously? Is this what we're eating?" "It's beef stew," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. It was Henry's favorite. She stood up, her chair screeching across the tile. "Well, I'm not Henry. This looks like something out of a school cafeteria." I opened my mouth, but before I could answer, she grabbed the bowl, flung it to the floor, and said the words that cracked something inside me. "You're nothing but trash in this house." The sound of the bowl shattering echoed through the kitchen. Michael didn't speak. Lena's lower lip trembled. For a moment, I wanted to shout, to demand respect, to remind them that this was my house. But instead, I felt an odd calm settle over me. It was like standing in the eye of a hurricane. I bent down, picked up the pieces, and wiped the floor clean. Vanessa's laughter faded down the hall. I rinsed my hands, washed the dish rag, and said softly, "So be it." That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked the dark hallway, each creak of the floorboard whispering Henry's name. His photo hung by the kitchen door, him in his work jacket, eyes kind, smile lopsided. I touched the frame. "They think I'm weak, Henry," I murmured. "They think kindness is surrender." Outside, the rain began tapping lightly on the windows. I slipped on my robe and stepped out to the porch. The wind carried the scent of wet earth and pine. My old dog, Sam, padded up beside me, laying his head on my knee. I stroked his fur and whispered, "It's just us again, old boy." But that's about to change. I thought about the people I'd met since Henry's passing, the women at the senior center who'd lost their homes to greedy children, the widows who'd been convinced to sign over deeds for safety. I'd listened, nodded, and told them to stand up for themselves. I had built something quietly, something no one here knew about, a network of protection, legal and moral, a foundation for women like us. Maybe it was time to use it. When dawn came, the house smelled of damp wood and coffee. I woke before anyone else, as I always did. I set the kettle on sliced oranges, fed Sam. The rhythm of ordinary things steadied me. Vanessa came down late, hair wrapped in a silk scarf, scrolling through her phone. "Coffee," she said, not looking up. I poured it for her, added a spoonful of sugar, and stirred, only this time I used salt instead. She took a sip, grimaced, and spat into the sink. What did you put in this?" I looked at her, calm as ever. "Oh dear," I said sweetly. "Must have grabbed the wrong jar." Michael entered just then, tie crooked, Lena behind him in her school uniform. He glanced between us, uneasy. Vanessa slammed the cup down and stormed off. I turned to my son. "Eat before you go, Michael. You'll need your strength." "For what?" he asked. "For whatever's coming," I said simply. After they left, I cleaned the kitchen, humming under my breath. I opened the small drawer beside the fridge and took out an old leather folder labeled Second Chance Foundation. Confidential. Inside were documents, letters, and one card with a number written in blue ink. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling Henry's presence in the quiet. Then I closed the folder and slid it back into place. Not yet, I thought. Not until she crosses the line one more time. Sam barked softly, as if agreeing. I looked out the window, the sunlight spilling across the yard, and said aloud, "Let her think she's in charge for now. Tomorrow she'll learn what respect tastes like." I brewed myself a fresh cup of coffee, black, no sugar, no salt, and took the first steady sip of a new beginning. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the kitchen window, catching the sheen of the clean floor where last night's stew had exploded. I'd scrubbed it until every mark vanished. The room smelled of lemon and soap, not humiliation. I poured coffee, steady hands, calm heart. Vanessa came down late, wearing Michael's old t-shirt like it was silk. Her hair was perfectly curled, her phone glued to her palm. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "Coffee, please. Strong." I reached for the sugar jar, but my hand stopped halfway. I glanced at the salt instead. Just one spoonful. A small lesson. I stirred it slowly, watching the crystals dissolve like memories. She took a sip, made a face, and spat it straight into the sink. "What the hell is this?" I didn't blink. "Is something wrong, dear?" she glared. "You trying to poison me?" I smiled gently. "Of course not. Mistakes happen." Her jaw clenched. She turned and stormed upstairs, the sound of her heels sharp and hollow. I set my cup down, listening to the quiet that followed. Peaceful. Too peaceful. Later, I sat by the window with Henry's old journal. The leather cover was cracked from years of use. He'd written in neat, patient handwriting about his days at the garage, about saving for our roof, about keeping his word even when no one was watching. On the last page, he'd written something I'd forgotten. "Respect isn't given by others, Clara. It's given by yourself when you refuse to bend too far." I traced the words with my finger and whispered, "I understand now." All my life I had bent for love, for peace, for family. I'd let people take pieces of me because I thought kindness meant surrender. But I'd learned something new. Kindness without boundaries is just an invitation to cruelty. I folded the journal shut and looked around the house that had once felt safe. Every wall carried memories, but it was time to protect them differently. The morning passed in strange quiet. Michael had already left for job interviews and Lena was at school. Vanessa stayed upstairs, door closed. I decided to prepare breakfast anyway, pancakes, bacon, fresh juice. The smell filled the air, warm and comforting. When I heard footsteps on the stairs, I didn't turn. "Good morning," I said, breakfast is ready." Vanessa appeared face expressionless. She sat down without a word. I served Michael's plate, then Lena's, then hers last. I placed her pancakes carefully in a small metal dog bowl Sam's polished clean. I set it gently on the table in front of her. For a second, nobody breathed. Vanessa's eyes widened. "What the hell is this supposed to mean?" I looked at her evenly. "You said I was trash, remember? You told me to eat with the dogs. I thought I'd make you feel included." Michael's fork clattered to his plate. "Mom, no," I said, voice steady. She should understand what her words cost. Vanessa stood, fury rising like fire. "You're insane." "Maybe," I said softly, "but I'm no one's trash." For a moment she looked like she might throw the bowl at me, but Lena's small voice broke the tension. "Mom, stop." Vanessa froze, blinking down at her daughter, who was on the verge of tears. I met Vanessa's gaze. "We can have peace in this house, or we can have war. You choose." She said nothing, only turned sharply and left the room. Michael sat in silence. His face was pale, his shoulders tense. "Mom," he began. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did," I interrupted. "I've spent my whole life teaching respect. Now I'm demanding it." He lowered his eyes, shame flickering across his face. Lena reached for my hand under the table. "Grandma," she whispered, "that was brave." I squeezed her fingers. "Bravery is just patience that ran out, sweetheart." After breakfast, I cleaned the dishes alone. The house was still heavy with the echo of what had just happened. Yet inside me, something shifted, a calm-rooted kind of strength. I took Sam's leash and stepped outside. The air smelled of dew and honeysuckle. We walked down the gravel path behind the house to the small garden Henry and I had planted together. The roses were beginning to bloom. I sat on the bench he built years ago, the wood faded smooth from time. "You'd be proud of me today," I murmured to the air. I finally remembered who I am. Sam lay at my feet, tail thumping gently. I thought of the women I'd met at church, support groups, widows, mothers, grandmothers, each with their own story of being dismissed, forgotten, or mistreated. Their eyes had the same tired resignation mine once did. That's why I'd built something secret, something powerful. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder marked Second Chance Foundation. Confidential. Inside were the documents I'd drawn up with Pastor Evelyn and Miss Harris, my lawyer neighbor. They detailed every clause, every signature, every legal thread tying this house to the foundation I'd built. 5 years of planning, quiet and careful. I hadn't told Michael, not because I didn't love him, but because I'd seen how easily good people can be swayed by others' greed. The house wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the foundation, with one condition: I could live here untouched for the rest of my life. No one could sell it. No one could force me out. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal and whispered, "You thought I had nothing, Vanessa, but I have a fortress made of paper and ink." The day went on. Michael came home late, tired but grateful he'd been offered a temporary position. I congratulated him and pretended not to see how distant he looked, caught between me and his wife. That evening, Vanessa didn't come down for dinner. I made soup anyway. Lena helped set the table, humming softly. "Grandma," she said suddenly, "Mom said she might move us back to Charlotte. Do you think she will?" I hesitated. "I think your mother says a lot of things when she's angry. She doesn't like this house." I smiled sadly. "That's because this house has walls that talk back." Lena frowned, confused. "What do you mean it remembers who built it? It remembers kindness and hard work. Some people can't stand that." Lena nodded slowly, her young mind turning it over. "I like it here," she said. "It feels safe." I brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Then that's what matters." When the dishes were done and the house quiet again, I sat by the window with a cup of tea. The moon hung low over the hills, silver light painting the trees. I picked up the phone and dialed a familiar number. It rang twice before a calm voice answered. "Evelyn Brooks speaking." "Pastor," I said softly, "it's Clara. Remember what we talked about a few years back?" "Yes," she replied. "Is everything all right?" "It will be. I just wanted to let you know if I call again you'll know why." A pause, then her warm voice understood. "But Clara, don't let anger guide you. "It won't," I promised. "Only truth." I hung up and sat in silence, feeling the weight of what was coming. Later that night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I opened my door slightly. Vanessa passed by, talking in hushed tones on her phone. "I can't take this anymore," she whispered. "The old woman's driving me insane. If Michael doesn't sell this place, I'll make sure she leaves one way or another." She didn't notice me standing there watching. When she disappeared into her room, I closed the door quietly and leaned against it. Well, I said to the darkness that didn't take long. I went to my nightstand, opened the drawer, and placed the phone beside the lamp. Underneath lay Henry's photo and the folder marked Protocol Second Chance Activation. I ran my hand over the papers and smiled, not cruelly, but with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. "They think they're dealing with an old woman who's easy to break," I whispered. "But they're about to meet the woman who built her own salvation." Sam barked softly from the hallway, as if agreeing. I turned off the light, the moon spilling its glow across the room, and said to the empty air, "Tomorrow morning, she'll learn that respect doesn't die with age. It only waits for the right moment to rise." The church smelled faintly of old wood and lavender polish. I hadn't stepped inside St. Mary's since Henry's funeral, yet somehow the air felt unchanged, thick with prayer and memory. Pastor Evelyn Brooks sat behind her desk, glasses perched on the edge of her nose, a stack of folders beside her. When she saw me, she rose with that same gentle authority she'd always carried. "Clara," she said, "I was hoping you'd never have to use this." "Neither did I replied. "But life doesn't always care about what we hope." She handed me a thick envelope stamped with gold letters, Second Chance Foundation, Welt 2019. The paper was heavy, formal, carrying the weight of everything I'd built quietly these past years. 5 years, I said softly, running my hand over the seal. 5 years since Henry died, and 5 years since I realized a woman my age can't afford to be naive. Evelyn nodded. "This foundation has already helped 3 other widows. You've done good work, Clara. Are you sure you're ready to make it public?" "I'm not making it public," I said. "I'm making it personal." The memory returned like an old bruise, the day that changed everything. It had been 2 winters after Henry passed. I'd joined the widows' support group mostly because I didn't know what else to do with the long evenings. That's where I met Mrs. Delaney, a quiet woman with trembling hands and eyes that carried too much fear. She told me how her son convinced her to put her house in his name for security. 6 months later, he sold it and moved her into a nursing home. She spoke of the day they came for her furniture, strangers touching her photographs, throwing away her curtains, leaving her with nothing but a suitcase. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat by Henry's empty chair, staring at the dark window, wondering what would happen if Michael or Vanessa ever decided I was inconvenient. By morning I had made my choice. A week later, I met with Mr. Harris, my neighbor, a retired attorney with sharp eyes and a kind heart. He'd lost his wife the same year Henry died. We'd shared coffee and small talk for months before I asked him to help me build something that could outlast fear. He listened carefully, then said, "You don't want to transfer ownership to anyone you know. You want protection, not dependence." "Exactly," I said. "I want to make sure that no one, family or not, can take this house from me or from women like me." That's how the foundation was born. We set up its charter quietly through the church. The property deed was rewritten under the foundation's name, granting me life occupancy until death. All decisions required signatures from 4 trustees, myself, Pastor Evelyn, Mr. Harris, and a community representative. To everyone else, it still looked like my home. Only those papers in the church safe told the real story. I remembered that afternoon clearly, the rain outside, the smell of wet earth, the hesitation in my hands as I signed the last page. Evelyn placed her palm over mine. "This means your family can't inherit the house, Clara." "Not directly." "I know," I said. "If they love me, they'll understand. If they don't, then they never loved me at all." She smiled sadly. "You've always been brave." "I'm tired of bravery," I whispered. "I just want peace." Now, sitting in that same office years later, I realized how full circle life had turned. The very protection I'd built out of fear was the weapon Vanessa would never see coming. Evelyn poured us both tea. "You could still wait," she said gently. "Maybe she'll change." I laughed softly. "She already has, just not for the better. She's the kind of person who mistakes kindness for weakness." I've dealt with her kind my whole life. I used to think I could love people into decency. Now I know better. Evelyn watched me closely. You're not doing this out of revenge, are you? I took a long sip of tea. No, Pastor. I'm doing this out of self-respect. On my way home, the wind tugged at my scarf carrying the smell of rain-soaked pine. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment watching the house through the windshield. It looked exactly as it had the day Henry died, white shutters, blue door, roses by the porch. But inside, everything had changed. As I stepped out, I saw Vanessa sitting on the porch, swing legs crossed, a glass of wine in her hand. Her phone glowed in her lap. She didn't even glance at me. Long day, she asked, voice smooth as silk and twice as fake. Productive, I replied, walking past her. She smirked. Michael says the house could use some upgrades. Maybe tear down that old shed in the back, build a studio. We'll make this place feel like ours. I stopped at the door. It's not ours, Vanessa. It's mine. Her laugh was short and sharp. For now. I turned just enough to meet her gaze. No, dear. For always. Her smile faltered for a heartbeat before she looked away. I went inside, shutting the door quietly behind me. That evening, I sat by the kitchen table, sorting the foundation's papers again. I'd kept them hidden beneath the bottom drawer for years, wrapped in Henry's flannel shirt. Seeing his faded name stitched on the collar steadied me. I checked each page carefully. Property title under Second Chance Foundation. Clause ensuring my lifetime residence. Bylaws preventing sale or transfer without board approval. Emergency protocol, immediate legal action in case of harassment or attempted eviction. It was all airtight. I smiled to myself. You thought I was helpless, Vanessa, but you walked into a fortress disguised as a farmhouse. Sam barked softly by my feet. I reached down, scratching behind his ear. We're safe, boy. Safer than they'll ever know. Just as I was about to put the papers away, headlights swept across the front window. Michael's car pulled into the driveway. Voices followed, his low and weary, hers high and sharp. Sick of living under her rules, Vanessa shouted. It's suffocating. Michael's voice trembled. Vanessa, she's my mother. This is her house. Then maybe she shouldn't live here. I froze, every nerve tight. The front door opened, and Vanessa's voice came closer, venom laced with wine. She treats me like a guest, like I don't belong. You don't, I whispered under my breath. The argument moved upstairs, muffled but bitter. I heard something slam, a door, maybe a heart. Then, silence. I folded the documents, slid them into the folder, and locked it in the drawer. The storm was coming faster than I'd thought. At dawn, I met Pastor Evelyn again outside the church. She was waiting in her car, engine idling, window rolled down. Clara, she said, are you sure about this? I'm past sure. She nodded. Then you know what to do. I'll call when the line's crossed. Let's pray it never is. We exchanged a look, two women who had seen enough of life to stop believing in easy peace. When I got home, I found Vanessa in the kitchen wearing one of my aprons, stirring coffee. She looked up, her smile too bright. Good morning. Sleep well, Very, I said. She placed a mug in front of me. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Maybe we can start over. I met her gaze for a long time. Starting over requires honesty, Vanessa. Can you manage that? Her smile faltered. Of course. Good, I said. Because honesty will be the only currency that works in this house from now on. I took a slow sip, letting the bitter taste settle. She blinked, confused by my calm. You really think you can control everything, don't you? I smiled. No, I just know what belongs to me. Later, while she was upstairs talking on her phone again, I stood by the window watching the light break through the clouds. I could hear her laughter, faintly sharp, hollow, echoing through the house like a warning. I whispered to myself, Henry, if you can hear me, I'm ready. Then I picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Harris's number. He answered on the second ring. Good morning, Mrs. Monroe. It's time, I said quietly. Activate protocol Second Chance. Understood, he replied. You'll have full legal coverage by tomorrow. Everything will move discreetly. Thank you. I hung up my reflection, faint in the glass. The woman staring back wasn't the same one who'd picked up shards of a broken dinner plate a few nights ago. Her spine was straighter, her eyes steady. Outside, the wind shifted, scattering the first petals from the rosebushes Henry had planted long ago. I watched them drift down the steps like little red promises and said softly, "Let the storm come. I've already built my shelter." 3 days passed after I called Mr. Harris, and the air inside the house had grown heavy like the stillness before thunder. Even the walls seemed to listen. Vanessa's voice sliced through the quiet that morning, shrill and impatient. "I'm not living like this, Michael. Either she sells this place or I'm leaving. I can't breathe in this museum." I stood by the sink washing coffee cups, pretending not to hear. Michael's voice was low, weary. "We can't just sell Vanessa. It's Mom's house." She laughed a sound sharp enough to draw blood. "It won't be forever. Old people shouldn't live alone anyway. We're doing her a favor." The words landed like stones in my chest. I kept scrubbing, listening to my own heartbeat echo against the porcelain. When she stormed out to the porch, I followed quietly. She was on her phone pacing. "I don't care what it takes," she snapped to whoever was on the other end. "Once the paperwork's ready, I'll handle her." She turned around suddenly and froze when she saw me standing there. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough," I said softly. Her smile returned, forced and plastic. "Oh, Clara, don't take it personally. I'm just venting." I wiped my hands on a towel. "Of course, we all need to vent. Just be careful who's listening." She brushed past me, her perfume trailing behind like smoke. That evening I went to the attic to fetch a box of Henry's things. At least, that's what I'd planned. But when I opened the closet, the box was gone. I called down the stairs. "Vanessa, have you seen a cardboard box marked Henry's Tools?" She appeared at the bottom step, arms folded. "Oh, that old thing, it reeked of oil and mildew. I moved it to the attic storage. You should thank me. That smell was awful." I stared down at her. "You moved my husband's things without asking." Her shrug was careless. "It's called cleaning, Clara. You should try it." My throat tightened. "This is my home." Her voice sharpened. "For now." That night I didn't sleep. Every creak of the house felt like betrayal. The next morning I found that she had replaced the living room curtains, Henry's favorite dark blue, with gauzy white ones that hung like ghosts. The master bedroom door was open, and inside I saw fresh paint on the walls, pale gray, instead of the soft yellow Henry and I had chosen decades ago. Michael's voice drifted from behind me. "She said it would brighten things up." I asked. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She means well, Mom. She's just trying to make the house feel more like home." I looked around the freshly painted room. "Whose home, Michael?" He couldn't answer. Later I heard hammering. Vanessa was having a locksmith change the front door. I stepped out onto the porch. "What's going on?" She smiled sweetly. "Security upgrade. We'll all feel safer." "Did you ask me?" She tilted her head. "Do I need to?" I stepped closer. "Yes, you do." The handyman looked between us, uncertain. Vanessa waved him off. "It's fine. Keep going." I said nothing else, just turned and walked back inside. My hands were shaking, but not from fear, from resolve. That afternoon, Lena came to find me in the garden. Her face was pale. "Grandma, Mom's been talking to someone about the house." I heard her say something about a realtor. I put down my watering can. "Did she say anything else?" She said, "Once the house sells, we'll finally be free." I knelt beside her, brushing dirt from my gloves. "Thank you for telling me, sweetheart." "Are you mad?" I smiled faintly. "No, just preparing." She frowned. "Preparing for what?" "For the truth to show itself." I looked toward the house, its windows gleaming in the afternoon sun, and thought how strange it was that something built with love could become a battlefield. That evening, Michael found me sitting in the living room with a folder open on my lap. "Mom," he said carefully, "Vanessa's upset. She says you're being cold to her." I glanced up. "Has she told you why he rubbed the back of his neck?" "She said you're trying to make her feel unwelcome." I folded my hands. "She doesn't need help with that. She does it to herself." He sighed. "I'm just asking you to be patient." I stood, meeting his eyes. "Patience is a virtue, son, but it stops being one when it turns into permission." He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, defeated. When he left the room, I whispered to the empty air, "You're your father's son, but she's the one holding your spine." That night I heard movement downstairs. I stepped into the hallway quietly and saw light flickering from the kitchen. Vanessa was there pacing, talking on speakerphone. "I don't care what she says, Doug," she hissed. "Just get the loan approved. The deed's in her name, but she's old. She'll sign anything if we push right." I froze. Doug. A banker, probably. My stomach turned cold. I walked into the doorway, calm and steady. "Can I help you with something?" She spun around, face blanching. Just talking to a friend." "Doug," I asked, voice soft. "He sounds like a very helpful friend." Her lips parted, but no words came. I took a slow step closer. "This house isn't for sale, Vanessa. It never will be. And if you try, the only thing you'll lose faster than your temper is your reputation." Her face darkened. "You wouldn't dare." "Oh, my dear," I said, smiling. "You have no idea what I'd dare." The next morning I made coffee early. The sky outside was bruised purple with clouds. When she came down, she didn't speak. Neither did I. The silence between us was louder than shouting. By afternoon, the tension had curdled into something electric. I was trimming roses when Michael came out. "Mom, what did you say to Vanessa last night? She's furious." I looked up from the shears. The truth tends to have that effect. He ran a hand through his hair. "She says you threatened her." "Did I?" I asked mildly. "Did you?" I looked past him toward the house. "No, Michael. I promised her." He exhaled, exasperated. "I don't even know what that means." "One day you will." That evening the sky split open with thunder. Rain lashed the windows as if the heavens themselves were impatient. Vanessa sat in the living room, wineglass in hand, flipping through channels. I stood in the doorway. "You've crossed the line, Vanessa." She didn't look up. "I don't care. I know," I said. "That's why this ends tonight." I took out my phone and dialed. Mr. Harris answered on the first ring. "It's time," I said. He didn't ask questions. "Understood." Vanessa finally looked at me, her face pale. "Who are you calling?" I ended the call and met her eyes. "My lawyer." Her laugh was shaky. "Over what you think you can scare me with papers?" "No," I said softly, "with truth." Outside lightning flashed, illuminating her stunned expression. "You're done treating me like trash in my own home," I continued, "and tomorrow you'll learn what dignity looks like when it comes with legal backing." She opened her mouth, but I turned away before she could speak. That night, I sat on the porch while the storm raged around me. Sam lay at my feet, shivering slightly with each roll of thunder. I leaned down, rubbing his back. "It's all right, boy," I whispered. "The storm's just washing the dirt away." Lightning lit the yard, and for a moment I saw Henry's rose bushes bow under the rain, then stand tall again. I smiled through the tears I hadn't realized were falling. "Tomorrow's the reckoning, Henry," I said. "Let's see who this house really belongs to." Thunder rolled again, but this time I didn't flinch. The next morning began with the sound of gravel crunching outside. I looked through the lace curtain and saw a silver sedan pull into the driveway. Mr. Harris stepped out in his gray suit, hat in hand, his briefcase glinting in the sunday. Vanessa was at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone with her usual disdainful calm. She didn't even glance up when I said, "We have company." "Tell them to call first," she muttered. I wiped my hands on a towel. "Oh, this visit isn't for me. It's for us." Her brows knit together just as the doorbell rang. When I opened it, Mr. Harris smiled politely. "Good morning, Mrs. Monroe." "Good morning, Mr. Harris. Please come in." He stepped inside, nodding toward Vanessa. "Mrs. Monroe, Mrs. Harris. I believe it's time we discussed certain property matters." Vanessa's head snapped up. "Excuse me." Before I could respond, Michael came downstairs, adjusting his shirt collar. "What's going on? Why don't you all have a seat?" Mr. Harris said, setting his briefcase on the table. "This will only take a few minutes." He opened the locks and drew out a stack of papers, neat and official. His voice was calm, measured. "As you know, he began the property located at 42 Willow Bend Lane. This house is legally owned by an entity known as the Second Chance Foundation. Mrs. Clara Monroe is the founding director and lifetime occupant. Under state law, no other party may alter, sell, or mortgage the property without the board's written consent." Silence followed, so heavy you could hear the clock ticking above the stove. Vanessa blinked rapidly, then laughed, a short, nervous sound. "That's absurd. This is her personal house." She's lived here forever. That's correct, Mr. Harris said. And that's precisely why she protected it 5 years ago. Everything you see here, this structure, this land, is part of the Foundation's trust. Michael looked at me, confusion clouding his eyes. Mom, what is he talking about? I folded my hands on the table. While you were building your own life, son, I was making sure no one could dismantle mine. Vanessa pushed back her chair, voice rising. You're lying. You can't just make up a foundation, mister. Harris opened another folder, sliding papers across the table. You'll find all the necessary documents right here. Deed transfers, notarized signatures, legal registration. Feel free to verify. Michael skimmed the top page, color draining from his face. You really did this. I did, I said. Because life teaches you that trust without boundaries invites betrayal. Vanessa's voice cracked. So what you're saying, we're squatters now? Mr. Harris stayed professional. Legally, you're temporary residents. However, Mrs. Monroe has the right to offer you a rental agreement if she wishes. Vanessa slammed her hand on the table. This is unbelievable, Michael. Say something. He looked lost, torn between anger and shame. Mom, why didn't you tell me? I met his eyes. Because love doesn't replace protection, and I hoped I'd never need it. Vanessa glared at me. You've set us up. You've been waiting for this. I shook my head. No, dear. I was hoping I'd never have to use it. But you made sure I did. The argument that followed was chaos in slow motion. Vanessa's voice rose higher with every sentence. Her face read, You're crazy. This is manipulation. You've tricked your own son. Mr. Harris remained calm. Everything here has been executed according to state law. If you wish to challenge it, you'll need an attorney of your own. But I should warn you, the Foundation's bylaws are airtight. Vanessa's hand shook as she pointed at him. You'll regret this. Both of you. Michael stood suddenly, his voice breaking. Enough. You think I wanted any of this? We lost everything, Vanessa. I came here for help, not a war. She turned on him, eyes flashing. And what did your mother give us? A lease? Respect, I said quietly. That's what I'm offering. For a moment, no one spoke. Rain began tapping lightly on the windows, the soft sound of cleansing. Vanessa looked around the room at the wall. She'd criticized the furniture. She'd rearranged the life she'd tried to claim. Then her voice came low, trembling. We have nowhere else to go. Then stay, I said simply. Stay as long as you wish. But under one condition, respect. For me, for this home, for what it took to build it. Michael's shoulders sagged. We'll stay. I'll find work. We'll pay rent. Vanessa turned away, silent tears streaking down her face. I could see pride fighting with fear in her eyes. Mr. Harris gathered the papers, closing his briefcase. Everything's been clarified. I'll send a copy of the rental agreement tomorrow. He paused at the door. Mrs. Monroe, you did well. I smiled faintly. I just did what I had to do. When the door closed, silence returned. The rain outside grew heavier. Vanessa went upstairs without another word. Michael sank into a chair, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. Mom, he whispered. You blindsided us. No, I said softly. I protected myself. There's a difference. He lifted his head. She was wrong to treat you like that, but this, it's harsh. Harsh, I repeated. Harsh is watching your husband die and realizing no one will stand between you and the wolves. Harsh is giving up your peace for people who call you trash. He stared at me for a long time, then nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. I am, I said, not unkindly, but I wish I didn't have to be. Later that night, the house was quiet again. I sat in the kitchen with Sam at my feet, the smell of rain drifting in through the open window. The tension had drained from me, leaving something else in its place, peace. I poured myself a cup of tea and watched the ripples shimmer in the lamplight. Revenge hadn't brought satisfaction. Truth had. Lena came in softly, barefoot in her pajamas. Grandma, yes, sweetheart. She hesitated. I heard Mom crying. Are we going to have to leave? I shook my head. Not if we all learn how to live right. She frowned. What does that mean? It means respect, Lena. For this house, for each other. That's all I ever wanted. She climbed into the chair beside me, resting her head on my arm. You're strong, Grandma. I smiled. Strength isn't loud, honey. It's quiet like the rain. When she went back to bed, I sat alone for a while longer, listening to the storm fade. I thought of Henry, of how he'd grin and say, "You always did know how to keep folks in line, Clara." I could almost hear his chuckle in the thunder's dying rumble. I looked around the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd once knelt to clean up broken plates, and felt something unclench inside me. The house no longer felt like a cage. It felt like mine again. I took a slow breath and whispered, "Justice doesn't always need a gavel. Sometimes it just needs a backbone." Outside, the rain eased into a soft drizzle and the first hint of dawn touched the horizon. Sam lifted his head, ears twitching as if sensing the change. "Good boy," I said, stroking his fur. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not completely. Upstairs, behind a closed door, Vanessa's pride was still burning. And pride, I'd learned, doesn't go out quietly. The next few days passed like the quiet after a storm. The air was heavy with what hadn't been said. I could feel Vanessa moving through the house like a shadow, doors closing softly, footsteps muffled, laughter gone. Michael kept busy with job applications, trying to fill the silence with phone calls that went nowhere. Only Lena seemed unchanged. She hummed while she did homework, sometimes glancing at me as if to make sure I was still smiling. By the fourth morning, I found Vanessa in the kitchen early, sitting stiffly at the table with a cup of untouched coffee. She looked tired. Not angry, just hollow. "I'm sorry," she said without looking at me. I waited. "I shouldn't have thrown that stew," she went on. "I shouldn't have called you what I did." Her voice was flat, rehearsed, the kind of apology meant to close a wound without cleaning it first. I poured myself coffee, the sound of it filling the space between us. "Thank you for saying that," I said, "but an apology without change is just noise." Her jaw tensed. "I'm trying." "Then try harder," I replied. She stood too fast. "You act like I'm some kind of monster." "No," I said calmly. "I act like someone who's been bitten before." She blinked, caught between guilt and pride, then left the room. That afternoon, I went to the community center to deliver some donation boxes for the foundation. The place was small but full of life, women folding clothes, men stacking canned goods, kids chasing each other down the hall. At the far table sat Robert Gray, the retired police officer who'd helped me set up the safety hotline. He smiled when he saw me. "Mrs. Monroe, rumor is you finally stood up to your hurricane of a daughter-in-law." I laughed softly. "Rumors travel fast around here." "Truth travels faster," he said. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine. The house is quiet, but peace has a cost." He nodded knowingly. "Always does. But I'll say this, when a woman starts standing up straight again, people around her have to learn to see her differently." I thought of Vanessa, of the tension in her shoulders when she said, "I'm sorry." Maybe that's exactly what she's learning. When I returned home, the air smelled of lemon and polish. Vanessa had cleaned the kitchen top to bottom. The counters gleamed, the floor shone. A small vase of daisies sat by the window. Michael came in from the porch looking relieved. "She's trying, Mom. I think she means it." I nodded but didn't answer. I'd seen too many false dawns in my life to mistake them for daylight. At dinner, Vanessa helped serve, her hands shaking slightly as she passed the plates. Lena told a story about school, and for the first time in weeks, laughter touched the table again. Light, careful laughter, but laughter nonetheless. Afterward, Vanessa lingered while I washed dishes. "I really am sorry," she said again, quieter this time. "I know I went too far." I was angry and scared. Scared of what I asked, losing everything she said. The house, the life we had, Michael's pride. I thought if I controlled everything I could fix it. And instead, you broke it, I said gently. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Yeah, I did." I handed her a towel, "Then start fixing it, not by controlling, but by respecting." She wiped her face, then smiled weakly. "Deal." That night I sat on the porch while fireflies blinked over the lawn. The scent of honeysuckle drifted through the air. For the first time I let myself relax. But the peace didn't last long. The next morning the doorbell rang at 9 sharp. When I opened the door, a man in a navy suit stood there holding a clipboard. "Good morning," he said. "I'm here from Howard Realty, Mrs. Monroe." "Yes," I said, though suspicion prickled under my skin. "I'm here to take measurements for the appraisal. Mrs. Vanessa Monroe scheduled it for today." For a second I couldn't speak. Then I smiled, small and sharp. "Oh, she did she?" He nodded. Said she's considering putting the property on the market. Well, I said sweetly, you're welcome to measure the front yard, but if you cross that doorframe, I'll call the police for trespassing. He blinked. I pointed toward the gate. Good day. He hesitated, then turned and left. I closed the door, my pulse steady as iron. So much for apologies. Vanessa came down 15 minutes later, hair perfect, voice light. Morning. Who was at the door? Someone looking for a home to sell, I said. He must have lost his way. She smiled faintly, too faintly. That's so. That's so, I replied. Funny thing though, he knew your name. The color drained from her face. I was just checking the market value. Out of curiosity. Curiosity, I repeated. Like a fox checking if the henhouse door is still locked. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I'd advise you to stop being curious about things that don't belong to you, I said softly. The foundation owns this home. You can't sell air, Vanessa. Her eyes flared. You think you've won. I smiled. No, I think I've endured. There's a difference. She turned on her heel and left the room. That evening, Michael came home early, his face tight with worry. Mom, what happened? Vanessa said you threatened her again. I sighed. I told her the truth, Michael. She says you're trying to push us out. Your wife invited a realtor to my door this morning. Does that sound like peace to you? He blinked, stunned. What she called them herself. I sent them away. You might want to ask your wife why she keeps planning exits from a house she doesn't own. Michael rubbed his temples. I can't believe this. Believe it, I said quietly. You married her. His shoulders slumped. I'll talk to her. Do that, I said, turning back to the sink. But make sure you listen too. The fight that night was brutal. Their voices tore through the walls, accusations, tears slammed doors. I didn't listen to the words, just the rhythm of it. Rage always sounds the same, no matter who speaks it. When the shouting stopped, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Michael appeared in the doorway, his eyes hollow. She's packing, he said simply. I nodded. Let her. She says she's going to her sister's in Florida. Then I wish her good weather, I said. He swallowed hard. I didn't want it to end like this. Sometimes endings are the only way beginnings can breathe, I said. He stared at me for a long time, then nodded slowly. You're stronger than I ever realized. No, I said, smiling faintly. I just learned to stop apologizing for surviving. By morning, the car was gone. Vanessa had left without a goodbye. Lena hugged me tight before leaving for school. Mom said she'll call, she whispered. She will, I said. One day. When they drove away, the house felt lighter than it had in months. Sunlight streamed through the gauzy curtains Vanessa had hung, and for the first time they didn't bother me. They made the room glow. I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, took it to the porch, and watched Sam chase a butterfly across the yard. Peace, I thought, isn't given. It's reclaimed. Then I whispered to the wind, Henry, it's done. She's gone. But as the breeze rustled through the roses, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't an ending. It was an intermission, the calm before the next act of whatever fate had planned. Spring arrived with the scent of wet soil and magnolia blooms drifting through the open windows. The house felt different now, quiet but alive. Michael had started a new job at the local construction firm, and every evening he came home tired but grateful. Lena laughed more, her voice echoing down the hall like birdsong. For the first time in years, I could walk through my kitchen without bracing for sharp words or cold silence. Vanessa was gone. Her absence sat in the house like a healing wound, tender but closing. Every morning I brewed my coffee, fed Sam, and watched the sunrise from the porch. The light spread over Henry's roses, their petals trembling in the breeze. We made it, I'd whisper. We're still standing. But peace, I've learned, is never a final destination. It's just a resting place between battles. A week after Vanessa left, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, only my name written in a delicate, almost hesitant hand. Inside was a short letter and a small silver ring I recognized immediately, one of the 3 I'd given her for Christmas years ago. Clara, it read, I've done things I'm not proud of. I don't know who I became in your house. Maybe fear made me cruel or pride made me blind. I need time to face myself. Take care of Michael and Lena. I'll be in touch when I deserve to be. There was no signature, just that ring shining faintly in the sunlight. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in Henry's old cigar box where I kept the things that still mattered: our wedding photo, his watch, and now this. Forgiveness doesn't come all at once. It arrives like the tide pulling and receding. 2 days later, Pastor Evelyn called. "Clara, are you free this afternoon?" "Always for you," I said. When I arrived at the church, she was waiting with a woman I didn't recognize, mid-40s, brown curls, an energy that filled the room before she even spoke. "Clara, this is Grace Whitmore, an attorney who's been working with senior advocacy programs. She's heard about your foundation." Grace smiled and extended her hand. "I've read about your model, Mrs. Monroe. You created something remarkable. I'd love to help you expand it." I blinked. "Expand, yes," Grace said. "Your idea of using property trusts to protect elderly homeowners is revolutionary. We could replicate it across the state with your permission." I looked at Evelyn, who nodded encouragingly. The thought of sharing what I'd built, of turning my private shield into a public sanctuary, sent a tremor through me. "It was never meant to be big," I said. "It was just supposed to keep people safe." Grace leaned forward. "Exactly. And now it can keep more people safe." Her words settled inside me like a spark catching kindling. That evening I told Michael about the proposal while we sat on the porch. He listened carefully, nodding. "That's amazing, Mom. You deserve this." Dad would have been proud. Lena looked up from her book. "Does that mean Grandma's going to be famous?" I laughed. "I hope not, sweetheart. I just want to help." Michael smiled faintly. "You already have." But as I spoke, I caught a flicker of something else in his eyes, relief maybe, or guilt. He'd begun to see what I'd endured, what I'd built out of necessity. "Mom," he said quietly, "I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you sooner." The words hit me harder than I expected. I reached for his hand. "It's all right, son. Sometimes life has to shake us before we wake up." A few days later, Grace came by the house to finalize paperwork for the foundation's expansion. She was thorough, patient, explaining every clause with precision. When she left, she turned at the door. "You know, Mrs. Monroe, stories like yours, women reclaiming their dignity, change more lives than you realize." I smiled. "Dignity isn't something you reclaim, Miss Whitmore. It's something you stop giving away." After she drove off, I stood in the driveway for a while, the scent of rain on the air. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of my age, not as a burden but as proof of endurance. That night the phone rang just after 9. It was Lena calling from upstairs. "Grandma, Mom's calling." My chest tightened. I took the phone from her and hesitated for a breath before answering. "Hello." Vanessa's voice came through the lines softer than I remembered. "Clara." For a moment I didn't know what to say. "I just wanted to check on Lena," she said quickly. "And Michael?" "They're fine," I said. "We're all fine." She was quiet for a moment, then sighed. "I'm glad." I could hear background noise, traffic, maybe waves. "Florida suits you?" I asked. "It's different. I'm seeing a therapist," she said hesitantly. I didn't realize how much of myself I'd lost, trying to be perfect. I leaned against the counter, letting her words sink in. "Perfection's a cruel master," I said. "I hurt you," she continued. "I hurt all of us. I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm trying to earn it." I closed my eyes. "That's a start, Vanessa." She exhaled, and for the first time her voice didn't sound like armor. "Tell Lena I love her." "I will," I said. "Take care of yourself." After the call, I sat in the dark kitchen for a long while, the phone still warm in my hand. Some wounds never fully heal, they just stop bleeding. The next morning the house felt lighter. I made pancakes and Lena set the table, humming a tune. Michael came in, freshly shaven, tie crooked, smiling. "Big day," he said. "They're talking about promoting me already." I raised an eyebrow. "That was quick." He shrugged. "Hard work and clean conscience, I guess." I chuckled. "About time." After breakfast, I walked with Sam to the garden. The roses had grown thick and wild since winter, petals heavy with dew. I clipped a few stems for the kitchen vase. Standing there, I realized the strange peace that had settled over me wasn't the fragile calm that comes after a fight. It was the kind that comes from acceptance, from knowing I'd done everything I could to protect what mattered. And somehow that protection had started protecting others too. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I sat by the window writing in my journal. My handwriting trembled slightly, but the words came steady. "Today forgiveness began where fear used to live. The house is quiet but not empty. The past still echoes in the corners, but now it sounds like a hymn instead of a wound. I closed the journal and looked out at the fading light. Peace had finally stopped feeling temporary. But deep inside, I knew the story wasn't finished yet. There was one more reckoning waiting on the horizon, one I couldn't yet see but could feel in the quiet weight of the evening air. The world was still turning and my lesson wasn't done. Rain fell softly that morning, steady, and cleansing, the kind of rain that smells like renewal. I stood by the kitchen window with a cup of tea, watching droplets chase each other down the glass. In the garden, the roses bent under the weight of the water, bowing as if in prayer. And there, under the porch roof, umbrella in hand, stood Vanessa. For a heartbeat, I thought I was imagining her. But then she lifted her face, rain glistening on her cheeks, and I saw that it wasn't pride shining there. It was something else. Regret. I opened the door. "You'll catch cold standing there." Her voice wavered. "May I come in?" I stepped aside. Of course. She closed the umbrella, leaving a small puddle on the porch floor, and followed me into the kitchen. I offered her a towel, and she accepted it with both hands as though it were something sacred. "Tea?" I asked. She nodded. "Please." The kettle hissed. We sat across from each other, steam curling between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the rain drummed steadily on the roof, filling the silence with something almost forgiving. Finally, Vanessa said, "I came back because I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the truth." I looked at her carefully. Truth has a way of finding its own timing. "Maybe it's finally yours." She took a shaky breath. "When I threw your meal that night, I wasn't angry at you. Not really. I was angry at myself. Losing control, losing the life I'd built, it made me feel small. And seeing you so calm, so sure, I hated that. Because I wasn't that woman anymore." I said nothing, letting her words fill the space between us. Her eyes shone. "I sold your pearls," she whispered. "I pawned them last winter. I told myself I'd buy them back once things got better, but I didn't. I walked past the pawn shop last week, and they were still there in the window. I stood there for a long time and realized what I'd really traded wasn't jewelry, it was my soul." I set my teacup down. "And now I want to buy it back," she said softly. "Not with money, with humility." For the first time, she looked me straight in the eyes, and I saw that the steel in her gaze had melted into something human. We sat quietly for a while, just listening to the rain. Then I said, "You can start by helping at the foundation. We always need an extra pair of hands." Her brow furrowed. "You'd let me? Helping others doesn't require permission," I said. "Only sincerity." She nodded, tears threatening again. "Then I'll prove it." That afternoon, she followed me to the community center. The volunteers looked surprised to see her but said nothing. I handed her a box of paperwork to sort through, expecting hesitation, but she rolled up her sleeves and began. Hours passed. She moved quietly, efficiently, her hair coming loose as she worked. When Mrs. Delaney, a widow we'd helped last year, came in, Vanessa greeted her kindly and helped her fill out forms. At one point, I saw the older woman touch Vanessa's hand and say, "You remind me of someone who finally learned to love right." Vanessa blinked fast, swallowing her emotion. I looked away, pretending not to notice. By the end of the day, we locked the doors in silence. The rain had stopped and the sky was washed clean. As we walked to the car, Vanessa said, "I didn't think helping others would make me feel lighter. I always thought giving meant losing something. Sometimes," I said, "it's the only way to gain what matters." She smiled faintly. "Maybe you're right." That evening, Michael came home early. When he saw her standing in the kitchen, his face shifted from shock to something softer. "Vanessa," he said, almost afraid to believe it. "Hi," she replied, voice barely above a whisper. He took a step closer. "You're here." "I'm here," she said, "but not the way I was before." They talked quietly while I pretended to tidy up. Lena came home from school, dropping her backpack when she saw her mother. Mom, Vanessa knelt, arms open. "Hey, sweetheart." Lena ran into her embrace, and the sound of that small reunion broke something inside me, something old and heavy. Later that night after dinner, we sat at the table together for the first time in months. I made my usual beef stew, the same stew she'd thrown to the floor. When I set it in front of her, she stared at the bowl for a long moment. "This smells familiar," she said. I smiled. "It should." Her lips trembled. "I don't deserve this." "Maybe not," I said. "But that's not the point." She picked up her spoon, and for the first time since that night, the sound of silver against porcelain felt right again. After dinner, she brought out a small box from her bag. Inside was a new porcelain plate, white with a ring of blue flowers around the rim. At the center, in delicate script, were the words, "Respect begins at home." She pushed it toward me. I wanted to replace the one I broke. "I know it's not the same, but it's better," I said. She let out a shaky laugh. "Thank you for letting me sit at your table again." I touched her hand. "Thank you for learning what that table means." Before bed, I stepped outside. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the world glistening under the streetlights. Vanessa joined me on the porch, wrapping her shawl tight. "I don't know how to make up for everything," she said quietly. "You don't," I replied. "You just live differently from now on." She looked out toward the dark garden. "Do you think people can really change?" I took a deep breath, watching the air mist between us. "I think they can remember who they were before the world hardened them. Change isn't becoming someone new, it's becoming yourself again." She nodded slowly. "I hope I can find that woman." "You already have," I said. "You came back." Inside, the house was warm, filled with the smell of stew and candle wax. Michael and Lena were laughing over dishes in the sink. The sound made the corners of the house glow again, as if Henry himself were sitting among us, smiling quietly. I caught Vanessa watching them, her eyes soft. "See," I whispered. "It's still possible." She turned to me. "I didn't think forgiveness could look like this." "Neither did I said. "Until now, when the lights were out and everyone had gone to bed, I sat by the window one last time. The rainwater still glistened on the rose petals outside. In their reflection, I saw something I hadn't in years, peace that wasn't forced but earned. I whispered to the night, karma doesn't always destroy. Sometimes it restores." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I fell asleep to the sound of quiet, the kind of quiet that means you've survived the storm and found yourself standing in the clear. The morning sunlight came through the kitchen window like honey, soft and golden. I was writing thank you notes for the donors of the Second Chance Foundation when the mailman stopped by with a thick envelope stamped from Washington, D.C. I almost didn't open it. Official letters had a way of carrying bad news, but curiosity won. The header read, "National Elder Rights Association, nomination for Community Impact Award." I sat very still. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking clock and Sam's tail brushing the floor. When I finally read it again, I laughed quietly. "Henry," I whispered, "can you believe this?" The house wasn't silent anymore. Upstairs, Lena's music played softly while she got ready for school. Michael hummed from the bathroom as he shaved. And in the kitchen doorway, holding 2 mugs of coffee, stood Vanessa. "Good news," she asked, her tone careful but warm. "The foundation's being recognized," I said. "Someone nominated us for a national award." Her eyes widened, a slow smile spreading across her face. "That's incredible, Clara. You deserve it." "We deserve it," I corrected. "You've been part of this too." Her gaze dropped to her coffee cup. "Not at first." I smiled. "Redemption doesn't check attendance records." A few weeks later, we held a small event at the Asheville Community Center, a seminar called "Respect Has No Age Limit." The room was full of women and men with silver hair and tired hands. They came to listen, but what I saw in their faces was something deeper: recognition. I stood behind the podium looking at them and said, "Many of us were raised to believe that love means giving endlessly, but love without respect is just surrender. We're here to remind the world that age doesn't erase dignity." The audience was silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in applause. At the back of the room, I saw Vanessa helping pass out brochures, smiling as she talked to an elderly couple. Her face looked softer these days, her eyes gentler. After my speech, a reporter from the local news station approached. "Mrs. Monroe, could we feature your story? Maybe an interview." I hesitated, but before I could answer, Vanessa spoke up. "You should. The world needs to hear it." I turned to her. "Then you'll be in it too." She blinked. "Me, yes," I said. "People deserve to see that forgiveness isn't just words, it's proof that change is possible." Her lips parted, speechless, and for the first time I saw pride in her eyes, not the sharp kind that wounds, but the kind that heals. The news segment aired 2 weeks later. It was filmed in my garden, the roses blooming brighter than ever. I wore Henry's blue scarf, and Vanessa sat beside me, her hands folded in her lap. The reporter's first question was direct. "Mrs. Monroe, your story started with conflict in your own family. What made you decide to forgive instead of cut ties?" I smiled faintly. "Because revenge gives you closure, but forgiveness gives you freedom." The reporter turned to Vanessa. "And you, Mrs. Monroe, what did you learn from that time?" Vanessa hesitated, then said, "That strength isn't about control, it's about humility. I thought I needed to win every argument to survive. But Clara taught me that survival isn't victory, it's grace." The camera stayed on us longer than I expected. Later that evening, when the segment aired, the phone started ringing. Calls from strangers, messages from people I'd never met. "Thank you for sharing your story," one woman said. "You made me realize it's not too late to start over." Another voice, trembling, said, "I thought my daughter and I were lost to each other, but maybe we're not." A week later, I received a letter from a widow in South Carolina named Margaret. She wrote, "I watched your interview 3 times. My son tried to convince me to sign over my property for security. When I saw you speak about the foundation, I found the courage to say no. I'm safe now because you spoke out. Bless you, Mrs. Monroe." I folded the letter, my hands shaking. Vanessa walked in holding a stack of new brochures for the foundation. "What's that?" I handed her the note. She read it, her lips pressing tight, eyes glistening. "She's one of hundreds," I said. "This is why we tell our stories." Vanessa nodded slowly. "I used to think telling the truth was dangerous. Now I see silence is what kills us." The following Sunday, the community center was packed again. This time people came not just to listen, but to share. An old man stood and said, "My daughter stopped speaking to me for 10 years. Last night she called. We're having dinner tomorrow." A woman next to him whispered, "Because of your story, Mrs. Monroe. Because you showed us that broken families can still heal." I didn't know what to say. My throat tightened. Then from the back I heard someone clap. It was Michael. He'd come straight from work, still in his dusty boots. And beside him, Lena was recording the moment on her phone. I caught her whisper to him, "She's famous now." He smiled. "No, sweetheart, she's finally seen." That night, Vanessa and I cleaned up after the event. The tables were littered with paper cups, name tags, and the scent of coffee and hope. She glanced at me as we carried boxes to the car. "I've been thinking, maybe we could start a mentorship program for women like me. People who've made mistakes and want to rebuild." I looked at her. "You'd lead it." "I want to try," she said, "if you'll trust me." I smiled. "I already do." She blinked, her throat tightening. "You really mean that trust doesn't mean forgetting?" I said. "It means believing that change is worth the risk." She exhaled shakily. "Then I'll prove you right." Back home, the house glowed with warmth. The kitchen smelled of bread baking Michael's doing. Lena sat at the table coloring flyers for the next foundation event. The ordinary rhythm of family life had returned stronger this time because it was earned. As I washed my hands, I looked around at the faces I loved. For the first time, the walls that once held anger now seemed to hum with peace. Vanessa poured wine into 2 glasses and handed one to me. "To the foundation," she said softly. "To forgiveness." We clinked glasses, and I added, "To beginnings that start where endings once stood." Later, when the dishes were done and everyone had gone to bed, I sat on the porch watching the stars appear. The sky was clear, washed clean by spring's earlier rain. I thought of Henry, of the years we spent building this home brick by brick, and how life had torn it apart only to give it back to me whole. I whispered, "You were right, love. Respect is the foundation. Everything else grows from it." Sam curled up at my feet, sighing contentedly. From the house came the faint sound of Vanessa's laughter, soft, unguarded, real. The world outside was quiet, but inside it was alive again. I smiled into the night. "The echo of change," I said aloud. "That's what forgiveness sounds like." And somewhere in the wind I could almost hear Henry's voice, low and sure. "You did good, Clara. You did real good." The call came early, before the sun had fully climbed over the trees. I was still in my robe pouring coffee when the phone rang. Mr. Harris's name flashed on the screen. "Good morning," I said, half smiling. "You're up early." His tone was grave. "Clara, the bank called me first thing. Someone tried to access the foundation's main account using your old authorization code. The cup nearly slipped from my hand." "What, they didn't succeed," he said quickly. "The system flagged it. But the request came from your area." My pulse quickened. "Who was it?" The name attached was Vanessa Monroe. For a moment, everything went still: the coffee, the clock, even the rain starting outside. I set the cup down carefully. "Thank you, Harris. I'll take it from here." When the call ended, I stood there for a long time staring out the window at the garden Henry and I built. It looked the same, yet suddenly it felt fragile, like peace balanced on a glass edge. Was I wrong to forgive her? By the time I heard footsteps upstairs, my hands had stopped shaking. I took my time making breakfast: oatmeal, sliced peaches, and toast. When Vanessa walked into the kitchen, I studied her face. She looked tired but calm, humming, as she filled a cup with coffee. "Morning," she said. "Morning," I replied. "Busy day ahead." "Always," she said. "I have to drop off the flyers for the mentorship program." I folded my napkin slowly. "Did that include visiting the bank?" She froze. Her hand hovered over the sugar bowl. "What, I got a call," I said evenly. "Someone tried to access the foundation's account using my authorization code." Her color drained. "Clara, I swear, was it you?" "No," she said quickly. "I was at the courthouse renewing my volunteer certification. I can show you the receipt." The silence stretched thin between us. I wanted to believe her. God help me, I wanted to. But old wounds have long memories. Michael came down, then still buttoning his shirt. "Everything okay?" Vanessa forced a smile. "Just a misunderstanding." I met her eyes. "We'll see." After they left, I called Mr. Harris again. "Find out where that request came from," I said. "I'll trace the IP," he promised. I spent the morning in the garden clipping dead leaves, trying to calm my thoughts. Rain clouds gathered overhead. My heart felt like one of those bruised roses, still standing but not sure how much more it could take. By afternoon, Harris called back. The request came from a computer at the community center. I frowned. "That's impossible." "Not impossible," he said gently. "Maybe someone used her login. Or maybe not." I finished for him. I hung up staring at the roses glistening under the first drops of rain. Maybe it was time to see the truth for myself. The next morning I arrived at the community center earlier than usual. The halls smelled of paper and coffee, the sound of volunteers echoing faintly. I followed the sound of typing to the foundation's office. There she was, Vanessa, standing by a computer, sleeves rolled up, hair tied back, surrounded by open folders. Her expression was focused, almost tender. "Morning," I said from the doorway. She turned startled, then smiled. "You're early." I could say the same. "I was setting up new donor accounts," she explained. "We're calling it the Dignity Fund. It'll help women start over after eviction." I stepped closer. On the screen I saw the foundation's logo and the words "New linked account, pending approval." I swallowed hard. That's what triggered the bank alert. Her brow furrowed. "Oh no. I used your code because I thought, well, you always said I should take initiative." I didn't mean. I let out a long breath, half a laugh, half a sob. "You scared me half to death." Her face crumpled. "Clara, I'm so sorry." I shook my head, relief washing through me like rain-breaking heat. "It's all right. Next time just tell me first." She nodded, eyes shiny. "I thought I'd lost your trust." "Not lost," I said softly. "Just tested." Later, back at home, we sat on the porch watching the storm clear. The air smelled of wet cedar and forgiveness. "I almost didn't come back," Vanessa admitted quietly. "When I left last year, I thought you'd never want to see me again." "I didn't," I said honestly. "Not at first." But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means refusing to let pain make the last decision. She nodded. "I'm still learning that." I looked at her carefully. "So am I." We sat in silence, listening to the rain taper off. The world around us looked new again, washed clean. That evening, Michael found us at the porch table, papers spread out, laughter soft between us. "What's going on here?" he asked, half smiling. Vanessa held up a form. "We're starting a new initiative. Housing support for displaced widows. Clara's idea." I laughed. She's the one with the spreadsheets. He looked between us astonished. You two working together, miracles happen, I said. He shook his head in wonder. Dad would be proud. Maybe, I said. Or maybe he'd just say, took you long enough. We all laughed then, and for a moment the years of tension melted away. After dinner, Lena helped clear the table while Vanessa packed some leftover stew into containers for the outreach event. She looked up suddenly. Clara, thank you. For what? For trusting me. Even when I didn't deserve it. I placed a hand over hers. Trust isn't a gift, dear. It's a bridge. You walk carefully, you reach the other side. Her eyes shone. I'm trying. I know, I said. And that's enough. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea. The rain had stopped completely. I opened my notebook, the same one I'd used to keep foundation notes, and began writing. Trust is not built in peace. It's forged in storms. Forgiveness doesn't erase what was done, it teaches you how to survive it without becoming it. I paused, listening to the soft breathing of the house around me. Somewhere upstairs, Michael turned in his sleep. From the next room came the faint creak of Lena's bed. The air was still steady whole. I smiled to myself. You see, Henry, I whispered, the house finally learned to rest. Outside, the moon broke through the clouds, silver and sure. I lifted my cup toward the window as if in a quiet toast. To trust, I murmured, to peace hard won, and to the storm that made it possible. And with that, I closed the notebook, the ink still wet, and let the night hold me in the calm it had taken a lifetime to earn. The late afternoon light fell soft and golden across the porch when the gray sedan pulled into the driveway. I recognized that car immediately. It was the same model Grace Whitmore used when she came to town years ago, the woman who had once taught me that protection was not paranoia. When she stepped out, her hair had gone silver around the edges, but her posture was still straight as a ruler. Still keeping this place as beautiful as ever. Mrs. Monroe, I smiled. Grace Whitmore. I thought you'd retired to Arizona. I did, she said, walking up the steps with a lawyer's purposeful grace. But justice never quite lets us go. Her voice carried that same mix of humor and command that had once steadied me through every legal fear. She reached out and hugged me, surprising us both. You look well, she said. Peace looks good on people, I replied. We sat at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the papers I'd been reviewing for the foundation's new projects. Grace glanced at the documents, nodding with approval. You've turned a safety net into a movement, Clara. I've read the reports. 3 counties have adopted your model. The board in Raleigh wants to meet you. I blinked, stunned. Meet me? They want to expand Second Chance statewide, Grace said. With you as the face of the campaign. My heart skipped. That's more than I ever planned for. Grace leaned back, studying me. That's usually how good things happen. We spent the next hour talking about the logistics, funding, staffing, legal work. Grace's sharp mind hadn't dulled a bit. As she spoke, I realized how far I'd come from the frightened widow who once hid her deeds in a drawer. I never thought I'd see this day, I admitted. Back then, I just wanted to make sure no one could take my home. I didn't dream about protecting strangers. That's how it starts, Grace said, sipping her tea. You fight to survive, then you realize survival can save others too. Her eyes softened. You've done something extraordinary, Clara. Don't downplay it. I smiled faintly. You sound like my husband. I'll take that as a compliment. When the conversation shifted to future leadership, Grace's tone changed slightly. The board wants a co-director, she said. Someone younger. Someone who understands both sides of the story. I didn't have to ask who she meant. Vanessa, I said. Grace nodded. If she's ready. I stared out the window at the rose bushes swaying in the wind. She's changed, Grace. I've seen it, but there's still pride in her, quiet now, but there. I'm not sure if it's strength or fear. Maybe both, Grace said gently. But remember, redemption doesn't come wrapped neatly. Sometimes you hand someone the torch and they burn their fingers before they learn to hold it steady. I thought about that for a long time. Then I nodded. All right, let's see if she's ready to hold it. That evening I called a meeting at the house. The dining room was full. Michael, Lena, a few members from the foundation board, and Vanessa, who looked both nervous and curious. Grace stood beside me like a pillar of quiet authority. Thank you for coming, I began. You all know what the foundation has become and what it means not just to me but to the women it protects. We've been offered a chance to expand, to reach more people than we ever imagined. Lena's eyes widened. Michael smiled proudly. Vanessa looked uncertain. But expansion means leadership, I continued. And leadership means trust. Grace stepped forward. The board would like to appoint a co-director to work with Mrs. Monroe as we grow, someone who can represent the next generation. A murmur ran through the room. I turned to Vanessa. I'd like that person to be you. Her mouth fell open. Me, yes, I said. You've walked through both sides of what we fight against: anger, pride, healing, forgiveness. You know what it means to lose control and to find it again. That experience is worth more than any degree. She shook her head slowly. Clara, I'm not qualified for something like that. You're more qualified than you think, Grace said. We don't need perfection, Mrs. Monroe. We need truth. Michael reached for her hand. You can do this. Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. You really trust me with this, I smiled. Trust is like a garden, dear. You water it or it dies. I'm just giving you the hose. For a moment the room was quiet except for the sound of rain starting outside. Then the board members applauded softly. Vanessa covered her face, laughing through her tears. I'll spend the rest of my life proving I deserve this, she whispered. Grace clapped her on the shoulder. That's the spirit. Even Lena cheered, bouncing in her chair. Mom's a director now, Michael grinned. Co-director, he corrected. The laughter that followed felt pure, no bitterness, no tension, just lightness. After everyone left, Grace stayed behind for tea. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and smelling of wet earth. You did the right thing, she said softly. Forgiveness is one thing. Trust is the real test. I nodded. It's strange. I thought my revenge story ended the night I called you about the house. But maybe it's still going, just in a different form. Grace smiled. Maybe revenge isn't about getting even. Maybe it's about outliving what tried to destroy you. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the crickets outside. You ever regret it, she asked. No, I said. Not one bit. Even the pain taught me something. It showed me who I could become. When she finally stood to leave, the moon had risen, spilling silver light across the porch. She hugged me once more. Keep building, Clara. You're not done yet. I watched her drive off, taillights glowing like small red stars down the dark road. Inside, Vanessa was sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread out, already taking notes. She looked up when I entered. I was thinking, she said. We could call the new program From Guilt to Growth. For women like me who need a second chance to make things right. I felt tears rise unexpectedly. It's perfect, I said. She smiled. Thank you for everything. Don't thank me, I said softly. Thank the lesson. Later that night, I stood in the doorway of the living room. Michael was asleep on the couch, Lena's sketchbook open beside him. The house was still the kind of quiet that feels like completion. I thought of Henry, how he used to say I'd change the world one stubborn act at a time. I smiled and whispered, You were right again, old man. The rain began again, gentle this time, a lullaby against the windows. I turned off the lights and walked toward my room, but paused at the hallway's end. Vanessa was still working, pen moving across paper, determination glowing in her face. For the first time, I didn't see her as my daughter-in-law or my adversary. I saw her as what she truly was, another woman learning how to rise. And for that moment, I felt at peace. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new beginnings. But tonight the house was whole. The evening sun dipped low behind the trees, painting the sky in soft shades of amber and rose. I sat alone on the porch, pen in hand, my old journal open on the table beside a cup of cooling tea. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. Sam lay curled at my feet, snoring softly, his gray muzzle twitching as he dreamed. The house behind me hummed with quiet life, Michael laughing somewhere inside, Lena playing soft music, and Vanessa's voice steady and calm, discussing next week's event with one of the foundation's volunteers on the phone. I dipped the pen and began to write. When my son's wife threw my meal on the floor, I thought that was the end of everything. My dignity, my family, my peace. But it turns out it was only the beginning. I paused, the ink spreading slightly on the paper, and smiled. I could still remember that night as clearly as if it had happened yesterday, the crash of porcelain, the sting of her words, the silence that followed. "You're nothing but trash in this house." I had believed her for one small, cruel moment, and then I didn't. The world outside was quiet except for the chorus of evening crickets. I took a slow sip of tea and looked toward the garden. The roses Henry had planted were in full bloom, their petals heavy with summer color. How he would have loved this season. When she called me trash, I whispered she didn't realize she was talking to compost. I laughed softly to myself, because even what's thrown away can grow something new. The porch light flickered on as the motion sensor caught movement. Vanessa stepping outside with 2 glasses of lemonade. "You shouldn't be out here alone, Clara," she said. "I'm never alone," I replied, nodding toward the roses. "Henry keeps me company." She smiled faintly and handed me a glass. "He'd be proud of you. He'd be proud of us," I said. Vanessa sat down beside me, her expression peaceful though her eyes glistened with unspoken emotion. "The foundation meeting went well today," she said. "We're adding 3 more families next month. Single mothers, 2 widows, and a veteran who almost lost his home." I nodded. "That's good work, Vanessa." She hesitated, then looked at me. "It's your work. I just keep it moving." "No," I said, "it's ours. This family built it, every mistake and every redemption." The door creaked open, and Michael stepped out, followed by Lena carrying a tray of cookies. "We're having dessert outside tonight," he announced. Lena grinned, placing the tray down between us. "Chocolate chip, Grandma." "I didn't burn them this time." "Then it's a miracle," I said, teasing her. Michael leaned against the porch rail, gazing out toward the fading light. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think that house, that job, that image of success, that's what mattered. But it's this right here, that's real." I looked at him, pride swelling in my chest. "You finally learned what your father tried to teach you: walls don't make a home. People do." He smiled. "Guess it just took me a while to see it." After dessert, Lena sat at my feet with her sketchbook, doodling the roses in the garden. Vanessa and Michael talked quietly on the porch, steps, their hands intertwined. For the first time I saw no pretense between them, only truth shaped by what they'd survived. "Grandma," Lena said suddenly, "Mom says I can help at the foundation this summer. Is that true?" I reached down and touched her hair. "Of course it's true. You'll be our youngest volunteer," she grinned. "Then maybe one day I'll run it." I chuckled. "And I'll be here old and gray watching you do it better than I ever did." She tilted her head. "You're already old and gray." The porch erupted in laughter. It was a small, perfect moment, and I knew then that happiness wasn't loud, it was gentle, like the whisper of wind through the magnolias. Later that night, after everyone had gone inside, I stayed behind staring at the stars. The air was warm, the cicadas loud. I whispered to the dark, "Well, Henry, we did it. The house is whole again." I could almost hear his reply in the rustle of the trees. "Took you long enough, Clara." I smiled, wiping a tear from my cheek. "You always were impatient." I leaned back, letting the stillness settle over me. In my journal I wrote, "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it redeems the future." Revenge gave me strength, but forgiveness gave me peace. I thought I was teaching Vanessa a lesson about respect. Turns out she taught me one about letting go. I looked at the last line and underlined it twice. Then I turned the page and began to write my final entry for the night. "To every woman who's ever been called worthless, remember this. Your worth isn't measured by who hurt you, but by who you choose to become after the hurt. Dignity isn't given. It's reclaimed." The door opened softly behind me. Vanessa appeared again, this time holding a folded blanket. "You'll catch a chill," she said. I smiled. Old habits die hard. She draped the blanket over my shoulders, then lingered for a moment. "Clara," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Do you really forgive me?" I turned to her. The porch light framed her face, and for a second I saw her not as the woman who'd humiliated me, but as someone's frightened child still trying to learn how to love. "I forgave you the moment I decided to stop carrying the weight of your words," I said gently. "You were cruel because you were afraid. But fear doesn't scare me anymore." She nodded slowly, tears catching the light. "I'll spend the rest of my life making it right." "You already started," I said. When she went back inside, I looked around me one last time. The porch, the garden, the glow from the kitchen window where my family moved like pieces of a mended mosaic. The storm that once tore through us had left something beautiful behind: truth, humility, and love that had survived the fire. I whispered into the night, karma doesn't always punish. Sometimes it educates. Sam lifted his head, his tail thumping softly, and I laughed. Yes, boy, even you've learned a few lessons. When the moon climbed higher, I closed my journal and set it aside. I looked straight at the camera resting on the tripod near the porch rail. It had been recording Vanessa's idea for our foundation's new video series. She said people needed to hear my story unfiltered from me. I smiled into the lens. To every woman watching this, I began. To everyone who's ever been told they're nothing, listen carefully. You are never trash. You are not disposable. You are a storm, a light, a seed that grows again no matter how deep it's buried. I leaned closer, voice warm and steady. If this story touched your heart, share it. You never know who might need to hear that it's never too late to stand tall again. Leave a comment, tell me what dignity means to you. Because every story of courage deserves to be remembered. I paused, letting the night sounds fill the air, the crickets, the whisper of wind, the faint laughter from inside. Subscribe to Grandma Remembered, I said with a soft smile. Where we tell stories that prove justice can be quiet, but it's always served. I reached out, turned off the camera, and whispered to the darkness, I am Clara Monroe. This was my story, the story of how one act of dignity turned humiliation into hope and revenge into redemption. Then I sat back, watching the last light fade from the horizon. The stars shimmered above, and for the first time in a long, long while, I felt exactly what Henry used to call the perfect silence, the kind that doesn't mean emptiness, but peace. And that's how my story ends, not with a slammed door, but with a porch full of light.